Good evening. I was thinking about Dad's lesson this morning. Oh no. It's happening again. I think I might need a new phone soon. Because my phone won't record anything. All right, well, I'm going to have to get it from you guys in the back afterwards. I was thinking about Dad's lesson this morning. And what was it, 2 or 3% of the things that he had gotten wrong. We had to point them out afterwards. And then I just thought about the 98% that he got right. and I appreciate that we have a family here, and we're able to point things out when you slip up. And we're also able to appreciate all the things that you get right. And I think that's a sign of a family, isn't it? You can point things out without, murdering each other afterwards. So, although maybe sometimes you do that more in a family than otherwise. Tonight, I want to talk about seeing the invisible God. I mentioned to some of you yesterday that this has kind of been something that was on my mind because I was asked to do a wedding yesterday for Carissa Drummond, formerly Carissa Drummond, and her husband Mason Fiatoa. I had to present Mr. and Mrs. Fiatoa. That was harder than it seemed, all right? Phonetically, you had to, let me make sure I get the pronunciation down. Anyway, so I was doing their wedding, and I was just thinking about the things that you can say at a wedding. And, when you do a wedding, I guess I don't know this. I've done 2 whole weddings in my whole life. But when you do a wedding, you want it to be centered around God, of course, but not a sermon. The wedding is not about the preacher, and so you don't want to preach a whole sermon at the wedding, but you want to bring people's attention to how marriage and God are interwoven. And so as I was chewing on that, Romans 1 and verse 20 kept coming up. So then I got chewing on that passage, and I thought that probably will preach. So let's not preach at the wedding, but let's maybe tuck this away and talk about it on Sunday night. So let's look at Romans 1, and we'll just start off there. Romans 1 and verse 20, a passage I'm sure is familiar to a lot of us. Paul beginning his letter to these house churches, this whole network of house churches in Rome, and he's talking about God's righteousness and his nature and some of the things that are going on in Rome that are a problem. And in verse 20, he says, for God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. The idea here is there are some people who just don't buy this Yahweh God thing. They look at the Roman idea of gods would have been, there's a God of everything. Well, there's not a God of everything, but there's a God for everything. Lots of gods. Lightning, man, something supernatural about that. There must be a God behind it. Zeus. Oh, man, the sea, something supernatural and really big about that. There must be a God behind it. Poseidon, right? Love, this untouchable power that attracts and bonds, and there must be a God behind that. Aphrodite, right? So they've got these gods that they see all over the place. And Paul essentially says they don't have an excuse to not realize that this is all pointing to the same God. I heard a preacher one time say that the Romans or the Greeks thought that there was a God over everything. They saw God everywhere they looked, and they were right. They just thought it was a lot of different gods, when in actuality, it was one true and living God. And I thought that was a great perspective. And so Paul, addressing these people in that context, says, you are right to look out and see divinity. You're right. In fact, if you look out and don't see it, you don't really have an excuse, because all of this points to there being a creator, there being an all-powerful God of the universe. I thought that was a passage that, like I said, a lot of us know. There's one thing in the passage that we're not going to dive into tonight, but every once in a while, I don't know if you've noticed this, I like to throw a bone out to you guys and see what you do with the questions I have about the text, because iron sharpens iron, all right? And I don't have all the answers, but as I was reading, I thought where's it at? The eternal power and divine nature. Eternal power and divine nature. Why those two? Why those two? And I don't have a great answer. All right, I don't have a great answer for that yet, but I think that's worth considering. Why is it that the creation seems to point, and Paul feels the need to only include God's eternal power and his divine nature? He doesn't talk any about his love or his character. It's interesting because I think he could have put a lot more there, but those are the two he chose. Interesting. A rabbit to chase for another time. So, the creation points to God. The world and the things in the world should point to God. The way that we usually talk about this, and the way I want to begin talking about this tonight, is with just that idea. The creation points to God. There's a guy who talks about the bigness and the smallness of the universe, all pointing to God, which, I like it when people make up words in their teaching, because sometimes those made up words help me. I need it dumbed down to the point of making up words. And so he talks about the bigness of creation. And when you look at how big our world is, that something bigger had to make it. And so our galaxy, our universe, is actually full of galaxies. There's a Disney Pixar did a movie, Luca. It was a really cute little movie, and Luca is this sea monster. It's a children's show. All right, he's a sea monster who can come on land and turn into a little human, and he's a kid. And all he knows in his whole world is this one little sea that he can swim around in, and he's depicted in the movie as a little farm boy, just a naive little farm boy. And then he goes on to the land, and that's where he begins his adventure. There's one little scene where he's talking to a human girl, and she's telling him about the sun. The sun is this giant flaming ball of fire, and if you go beyond the sun, there are not beyond the sun, but if you go beyond the stars, there are these other planets, right? And that we're just one planet in a whole system of planets. And our solar system is just one solar system in a whole galaxy of solar systems. And that our galaxy is just one galaxy in a whole universe of galaxies. And as they go back and forth, he goes, and then what is next? And she goes, I don't know. And it's just this wonder at how big our universe is. The estimate right now, ever-changing, and it's an estimate, is that our universe is full of somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 billion galaxies. That our galaxy, the Milky Way, full of all sorts of different solar systems and things, is one of 100 billion different galaxies. From what I understand, the numbers on that are as vast as the numbers of grains of sand on all of the beaches in the world. That it would be like plucking our galaxy out of the beach. One grain of sand. Unfathomable. Unfathomably large our universe is. There are all sorts of anomalies and things within the universe that are very interesting. One of the things that I heard pointed out was these things called neutron stars. Neutron stars, and they are very small in comparison, but they are very big when you study them. These neutron stars are apparently hundreds of millions of tons in weight, that they are extremely heavy and extremely dense. And because of this, their gravitational pull is astronomical, so much so that it actually is pulling in on itself and collapsing in on itself. They're so dense, they're so heavy that they are imploding, collapsing on themselves. And apparently, I haven't seen one, but I'm taking some people's word for it, that these hundreds of millions of tons fit in the size of a tablespoon. That they're these very small stars that are so dense and compacted that they are just this big and yet have a gravitational pull so strong that they are collapsing in on themselves. Our Earth is racing through the galaxy. I don't know if you knew this, but we are moving right now. All of us are flying through this galaxy at roughly 67,000 miles an hour. I don't know if you guys have ever gotten to share a car with Justin Hill behind the wheel, but he likes to drive fast. All right? Justin drives fast, all right? Sometimes uncomfortably fast, but always safe, always safe. Justin likes to drive fast. He doesn't ever touch close to 67,000 miles an hour, all right? We can rest assured. But you are moving that fast at all times. And maybe that should make you want to wear a seatbelt. Because not only are you flying through the galaxy at 67,000 miles an hour, you are also spinning whilst spinning and flying. And you're spinning at roughly 1,000 miles an hour rotational speed. And so you've got this Earth that is massive. I mean, when we think about the size of the Earth, it's enormous. The motion that the Earth is going through, it's flying through the galaxy, it's rotating around the sun. It's unbelievably large in scale, and something bigger than our Earth had to make our Earth. And then you just remember that you can zoom out a little bit more, and our Earth is in a galaxy, and our galaxy is in a universe. And all of this, just the sheer bigness, the sheer size of it, should point us right back to a God that is even bigger, a creator that is even bigger than all these things. But that's the bigness. When you zoom back in and you start looking at the smallness of the world, there's an argument some of you may be familiar with called the fine-tuning argument. And it's really an excellent debate point in the existence of God, or at least the evidence of a creator as opposed to random Big Bang kind of stuff. But this fine-tuning argument focuses on the smallness of the way our universe is put together and held together. Our Earth is roughly 93 million miles from the sun. Because of that, we orbit the sun. The sun's gravitational pull keeps our Earth close to it, and we orbit around the sun. If we were 92 million miles away from the sun, we would at some point collapse into the sun, or the Earth before it got there would burn up because it was too close. If we were 94 million miles away from the sun, then we would pull away from the sun, and we'd be flung out into space and freeze to death. Life would not be able to be sustained if we were 1 mile closer or 1 mile further from the sun. And yet, right at 93 million miles is the sweet spot. That dial is turned to exactly the right spot. The Earth is also, though, tilted at 23.5 degrees. Now, this is interesting because most other planets aren't tilted on their axis. Most other planets are normal, and then the Earth just kind of walks with a little bit of a tilt. But the reason for this is because if the Earth was not tilted, it would do this thing called becoming tidally locked. Here's what it is. Our moon is in orbit of our Earth. And we only ever see one side of, have you heard the dark side of the moon? That's because there is literally only one side of the moon that we ever see. It's because the moon rotates around the Earth like this. It doesn't ever spin so that you see there's actually a dark side that we don't ever get to see. And it's because of the gravitational pull of the Earth keeps the moon tidally locked. It spins around facing only one direction. If the Earth were tidally locked to the sun, then one side of our Earth would be burnt up, and the other side of our Earth would be frozen. Our tilt allows us to spin and not be frozen or burnt up. But that actually wouldn't be enough. In fact, the Earth needed to be pulled towards the sun and also be pulled away from the sun for this to all work. And so the moon functions as the other gravitational pull, keeping our Earth perfectly in balance between the sun and the moon. The moon pulls roughly 60%, while the sun pulls about 40%. And this tension allows our Earth to sit perfectly and rotate perfectly around the sun and sustain life. No moon, no life. No sun, no life. Mismatched gravitational pulls of 39% and 61%, no life. Our air is made up of 21% oxygen. If it was 100%, we would all die. If it was 22%, we would all die. If it was 19%, we would all die. Our ocean is 3.4% salt. Which, I don't know if you've ever made a little salt water to gargle before, but 3.4% is an enormous amount. I remember the first time I think it was my nephew, Courtney's sister's kid, went to the beach, and he got in the ocean water for the first time. And, of course, he's a child, so they all go mouth first into everything. And he went into the ocean, and he came up with his tongue just circling his mouth, licking. He's like, what is this taste? And if you've ever been in the ocean, you know 3.4% is a lot of salt. What's really interesting about it, though, is that the salt content in the ocean helps to sustain life on Earth. And if it were just tweaked a little one way or the other, again, that knob, that dial, is exactly tuned into where it needs to be. And it matches, I thought this was really interesting, it matches our salt content in our blood as humans. Humans and the ocean both have 3.4% salt to them. That's interesting, human blood and the ocean. And again, either one, 3.5, 4% salt, no life. These are, how many do we do? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 5 or 6 different examples of the way that the universe is finely tuned, down to the fraction of an inch, down to the littlest detail. There are thousands of these, thousands. And you might think thousands, right? But here's the thing. If any one of these dials is tilted off its exact spot, life is unable to be sustained on the earth. You cannot look at the smallness, the detail, the finely tuned nature of our world and not see a design and not see something that points back to a creator, someone who tuned it appropriately. You don't pick up a guitar, let's put it this way. You don't pick up a guitar and strum it and go, oh, that sounded great. What a happy accident. You say, someone must have tuned this recently. Because all of us have picked up a guitar that sat for a while and strummed it and gone, oh my, this needs tuning. Our world is finely tuned down to the smallest detail. And when you look at the bigness of the creation and the smallness of the creation, man, you can't help but see how it points to a creator. Now, this is the way we normally talk about Romans 1:20. I think it's obviously an appropriate way. I think it's a powerful message. But as I was thinking about the wedding that I was doing, the phrase, a good marriage reflects a good God, just kept kind of coming to my mind. That was kind of my catchphrase that I kept hearing. A good marriage reflects a good God. And apparently I'm not the only one who thought this. When God describes his relationship with his people in the Old Testament, he uses this wedding, marriage relationship vocabulary. He talks about Israel as his bride. He uses this metaphor all over the Old Testament, but especially in the prophets when he's describing them as an unfaithful bride. He also uses the Ten Commandments. I think we've talked about this before. I don't remember if it was last summer or 2 summers ago that we did the walk through the Ten Commandments. But these 10 Commandments match the pattern and the format of an ancient wedding vow system. And so when God decided to make his covenant, which would have been terminology associated with marriage, his covenant with Israel, what did he use? What way did he communicate with his people but through marriage language? And so there's this idea that marriage is something that reflects God. In Genesis chapter 2, God creates marriage. And he creates this thing that meets the fundamental need of all humans, not to be alone. And then Paul, of course, picks up this metaphor and picks up this imagery in Ephesians chapter 5 when he tells wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. And then a couple verses later, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And so there's this idea that a good marriage reflects a good God. Well, how? So if we're supposed to be able to, like Romans says, look at creation and be pointed to God, maybe too we are meant to be pointed to God when we look at marriage. I wrote down a couple of these, and for a couple of you who are at the wedding, you might recognize this, but it's what I was chewing on, so it's what I'm preaching on. You think about the joy that is a part of a good marriage. Certainly not every second, but the joy that a good marriage can bring to not just the relationship, but to those around the relationship. Some of the highest highs that you experience in your life are those moments in your marriage. And man, you can't help but think about how the joy in relationship points to the joy of a relationship with God. We think about the peace. The image that I immediately thought of was the two old people sitting on their porch in their rocking chairs, the two rocking chairs, and they're not doing anything but listening to nothing. Quietness, peace, stillness, tranquility. You think about that. In reality, those moments of peace kind of pop up all throughout the life of a marriage. But you think about the peace that you're able to have after years of faithfulness, and you can't help but see the rest and the peace that God promises in eternity. A good marriage reflects a good God. You think about the adventure in marriage when you get married, and I mean, marriage is an adventure. For better or worse, it is an adventure. And really, what adventure is good all the way through? Those stories are boring, and they don't make for really great heroes. A good adventure has a lot of mystery, intrigue, suspense, tension, excitement. You think about how God called Abraham in Genesis 12. I mean, Abraham is 75 years into living in this same place with his family. And God says, hey, Abraham, get up and go. Abraham's like, to where? And God's like, I'll let you know when you get there. The place that I will tell you. That's what God says to him. What an adventure, right? God calls Abraham onto this adventure. In marriage, you go on an adventure together. I think I jokingly said you have a new road trip partner for life, right? You get to go on an adventure. You get to experience the highs and the lows, and following God is truly an adventure. The stories of the Bible sure show us that over and over again. In a good marriage, you have forgiveness. There's a deep need for forgiveness, sometimes daily, hourly, sometimes weekly, sometimes bigger than others. But if you don't have forgiveness, you're not going to have a marriage for very long, at least. And so a good marriage requires forgiveness. It's a necessity. I mean, you can't hear forgiveness without thinking about God and all the abundance of forgiveness that he lays upon us. You think about forgiveness the way that Jesus described it, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Like just an unfathomable amount of forgiveness. Is that not what you see in any marriage that makes it? It's just an unreasonable amount of forgiveness. Oh, a good marriage reflects a good God. Within a marriage, there is the opportunity to create life. In Genesis chapter 1, God talks about how God wants to partner with humans to fill the earth and subdue it. He gives humans the command to be fruitful and multiply, have some babies, and fill up my good creation. In essence, God said, I created 99% of it. You go ahead and help me. Fill it up. Create some more. That's a really incredible gift. That's a really incredible thing that God wants us to do. And within the confines of a marriage, creating life is something that we get to partake in. And that's a really special thing. Suffering. We talked about this, I believe it was last Sunday, although it feels like it might have been 2 months ago at this point. We talked about suffering. God never promised to stop suffering. And as beautiful as the vows were yesterday, neither one of them promised to avoid suffering. In fact, both of them specifically mentioned the difficult times. And you know what they didn't say? They didn't say, I promise to avoid the difficult times. I promise to fix all the difficult times. I promise to get away. They said, I'll be with you through them. In a good marriage, you commit for better or worse, traditionally, right? You commit for, I hate this one, for richer or for poorer. It's an unreasonable amount of ours. Right? You commit in sickness and in health. In a good marriage, you commit through the suffering, not to avoid it. And that can't help but point us to God, that he has not promised to avoid suffering for us or just give us an easy life, but to be with us through it every step of the way. He's never going to leave our side. And in a good marriage, you have faithfulness, that there is faithfulness from one side to the other. And you can't even hear that word without thinking about God's faithfulness to his covenant, like we're talking about in Ezra and Nehemiah, God's faithfulness to his people. putting up with them, forgiving them, enduring the suffering with them through the good and the bad. A good marriage reflects a good God. And so if we think about the creation, the world pointing back to God, I think you can look at the vastness of God's world and the actual creation. I think you can also look a bit smaller and a bit more relationally at marriage, because a good marriage reflects a good God. One other place that I thought really stood out to me, and this just might be the time of life that I'm in, but I couldn't help but think about children. That there's something about children. I have children/parenting, because sometimes it's the child, just the child by themselves points you back to God. But other times it's the parenting. And I don't mean that like my parenting, although certainly that, but just watching someone parent can really point you back to God. This, again, is not a foreign metaphor. At the Exodus, it was the first time that God described people, Israel, as his firstborn son. He says, I'm going to deliver my firstborn out of Egypt. So God right there has instituted or implemented a metaphor describing his relationship to his people as a father to children. That was not a common metaphor for the people during Jesus' day. In fact, when Jesus in Matthew 5 taught them how to pray, what were the first words? Our Father. Now we hear that and we don't think anything of it, because since I was 3-4 years old, I would say, Heavenly Father, thank you for this day, and thank you for our food, and thank you for all the things you've given us. I mean, that was how I began every single prayer, and so much so that it almost became its own word. Like, it wasn't even all these, it was just this sound that I did at the beginning of the prayer. All right, but this is just how we think about God, because we're so familiar with that language. Our Father. Not so for the Pharisees, not so for the Israelites, the Jews at that time. In fact, that would have been the most scandalous part of that whole prayer. I'm supposed to say, our Father, my Father? Well, that was the image Jesus thought fitting to describe how we should approach God, like a loving Father. Isaiah uses the imagery to describe God of a woman nursing her child. He says, can a woman forget her nursing child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her womb? Is that even reasonable? Of course not. And he uses that to parallel how God is not going to forget his children. And so God is described metaphorically as a father. He's described as a nursing mother. He's described as a parent. And so there's something about parenting in our world that should point us back to God. I think that there are, a lot of these. So I tried to pick ones that maybe were not as just plainly obvious. Patience is one. My goodness, one of my kids blew bubbles today during worship. Did anyone else see it? Pulled out a little wand and Alexa said it was the best part of her day. And then and she said the best part was actually not just the bubbles, but she said the reaction, the very quick movement of me and Courtney to stop it. Worship's not time for bubbles. Patience. I had at least one, at different times I had all 3 kids in my lap today. I think attempting to unbutton my shirt with their back, squirming and wiggling and trying to disrupt the entire service. Listen, patience is one of these that should point us back to God. When you deal with a child, whether you are their parent or their teacher or their babysitter or their uncle or their aunt or their anything, when you deal with a child long enough, you realize, whoo, is that how God feels about me sometimes? And it's quite a lesson. It reminds you of the patience that a good God must have for his children. There's something about children themselves, though, that is inherently, it's different. It's different. Kids see the world differently. I really would love to be able to see the world the way a child does for a moment. There's an innocence that children have. I don't mean naivete. I don't mean that they just haven't lived long enough to know. Sometimes kids know things and still choose innocence. It's just like who they are. They don't see somebody as a threat or someone who's wanting something from them. They just have this innocence about them. They have a tendency to want good things for people no matter what. It just reminds me of the way that God doesn't want anyone to perish, but he wants everyone to inherit eternal life. Kids have this innocence to them, this desire for good for other people. Kids also have this I don't know how to describe it exactly. As I was chewing on it, the words aren't quite coming to me, but this value of, you know what? Maybe it's the language of reckless love. They have this reckless approach to relationship. Have you seen kids become friends? It's very fast, and it is very intense. They meet each other, and if you're my kids, you don't learn anyone's name ever. Half the time they're at a playground, I'll be like, "Oh yeah, is that your friend? What's their name? They've been playing for an hour." I don't know. That's usually what they tell me. But you know what? They are friends, and they have make believed an entire world and an entire setting and an entire life that they've been living for the last 30 minutes with this friend. And when they leave, they'll say something to the effect of, "When can I see that friend again?" There's an episode of Bluey about this, where Bandit, the dad, takes his daughter to the park in the morning before the rest of the family wakes up, and they meet another dad and another daughter, and the daughters are immediate friends. We're friends. And then later that morning at breakfast, Bluey, the daughter, asks her dad, "Are you and so-and-so's dad friends?" And he goes, "I don't know. I don't really know him." Well, it took 3 minutes and one play date for Bluey to make a friend. It took 4 play dates and an awkward interaction for her dad to make a friend. There's an innocence in relationship. There's a desire for relationship that children have, a trust that children have of people that is really beautiful and points back to God. There's a perspective that being around children can give you that reminds you of God. The illustration, the metaphor that we used in the lesson a week ago about a child learning to ride a bike and scraping their knee. As the adult, you know a scraped knee is worth it. As an adult, you know that scraped knees are not the end of the world. And as an adult, you know that a scraped knee does not last forever. Try and tell it to a crying child with a scraped knee. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear because for them, that injury, that mortal wound, is the end of their universe as they know it. It'd been better not to get on the bike. Why is this happening to me? And yet as an adult, we have a perspective watching that child, knowing, well, someday you'll get where I'm at. You'll understand it's not that big of a deal. Someday you'll know that the freedom of riding a bike was well worth 100 scraped knees. Maybe not 100, maybe 100. Riding a bike is incredible. That was the coolest part of that sermon. As soon as I started talking about riding a bike, a whole conglomerate of children were like, "Yeah, riding a bike." They started audibly responding to me. I don't know if you guys could hear it, but it was really neat. There's a perspective that you get in dealing with children that points you back to God. Is this the perspective God has of my life? There's a selflessness that is learned when having to deal with children. Their needs are just more important than your needs. And this last one, I wrestled with how to put this. Because if I say the sentence that the vulnerability teaches you something about God, that God is vulnerable, I think all of us would kind of bristle at that. God is vulnerable. How in the world is the creator, the all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe vulnerable? Like, surely he's not, right? But there is something that happens when you love a child, parent, aunt, uncle, friend, godfather, whatever. There's something that happens when you love a child. I've heard it described as your heart walking around outside of you. Right? There's something that happens where because you love a child, you have opened yourself up to hurt. You have become vulnerable because that kid that you loved and that you knew and that you cared for and that you played with and that you held is going to do something stupid. They're going to hurt themselves. They're going to hurt you at some point. They're going to change. And that opens you up. That makes you vulnerable. because you've given some of your love, some of your heart to this child. God's done that for us. God has chosen to be vulnerable to us hurting him. I don't know how. I can't explain to you the theology of this, but this is something that happens. I think about Jesus weeping. The all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe become flesh, walking on the earth. What? Well, he had to be vulnerable enough to experience that hurt. And he was. The song, "Can He Still Feel the Nails," comes to mind. Am I causing him pain every time I sin? In a sense, I'm sure we are. I'm sure it hurts our Father when we hurt ourselves or when we reject him or rebel. And so there's something about the vulnerability of loving a child that reflects the vulnerability God allows when he loves us. It's all over the world. There are these things that point back to God. What I really want us to take away here is the idea that it's not just the creation, although that absolutely points to God. It's not just marriage, although that absolutely reflects God. It's not just children. There is something about God that is being reflected by everything that you see. To prove it, I just thought of this right now. How does a chair reflect God? Well, it's trustworthy. Was that silly? Absolutely. Does that change the way you think about the world? Quite possibly. Every single thing around you has the ability to reflect something about God to you. Because everything in this world was created by this God. The creation reflects the Creator. He created marriage, so of course it points back to him. He created human ingenuity and inventions. And so when we create, like something about that is going to point back to God. And you might say, everything? Don't you know our world is full of suffering and sin? I didn't say everything was a perfect, shiny mirror. Sometimes the things that reflect God reflect a distortion of who he is. And you see, well, there's something that reflects God in that, but it's not the way that God really looks. Everything in our world is a reflection of God. There's a song, I think it's called Every Time. It's a youth song. It says, every time I kneel to pray, I open up my heart to the Lord. There's a verse in this song where it says, every time I see a child, I see the gentleness of my Lord. Every time I watch a storm, I know the awesome power of my Lord. Every time I see the cross. That's how the song ends. It's a gentle, simple, musical reminder of the exact lesson that we're discussing tonight. Every time you look somewhere, you should see a reflection of God because he is above all and through all and in all. To reference a preacher from a couple weeks back, everything is physical and spiritual. And so everything reflects this God. And I think the challenge tonight, the simple challenge, is to change the way we look at the world. I think very often we look at the world and we see things that are worldly things and godly things. But if God created the world, then the world should reflect the God. And if we could take a second and see the world as if God is everywhere and ever present, it just might change the way that we see people and the way that we live our life. I think that's our challenge tonight. See the reflection that the world is trying to show you. See God everywhere you look. And then, like the song ends, every time I see the cross, remember. Now, all of us might fill in that blank a little bit differently. And I think all of us would probably be right. Every time I see a cross, I remember the sacrifice. I remember the love. I remember the suffering. Every time we see the cross, we should be reminded of what needs to be done or needed to be done on our behalf. And that's why we end every lesson with this invitation, because that is really the thing we need to look to remember and to center ourselves back in this story of God's redemptive plan. And so if you need to look at the cross and know more about that tonight, man, we can we can pull it out and we can show you all about the cross. And if you need the prayers of the church, whatever you need, you let us know. We'll be happy to pray with you, for you, and love you. If you'll just come, let us know while we stand and sing.